We have Zach Frankel and Brian Moench, and they're going to present on when will the Great Salt Lake reach a new record low? Zach.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate your participation today and your interest in the future of the Great Salt Lake. And I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Brian Moench, founder and president of the Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. We are here today to have a common sense, straightforward conversation about what Utah is doing and what Utah is not doing for the Great Salt Lake. So we're going to dig right in. And before I do, I just want to mention, if you're interested in getting more involved in what you hear today, please sign up for more information. There's a couple of staff members running around that have these sign-up sheets, and we'd love to get you more engaged. Here you go, Amy.
Thank you.
So our two organizations, Utah Rivers Council, Great Salt Lake Waterkeeper, and Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, finally crossed the finish line on this major study on the air quality impacts of a desiccated, i.e. drying Great Salt Lake. These are the repercussions of a 25-year failed water policy at the Great Salt Lake under Utah's leadership. Downwind showcases how we, the downwind population, are now subject to a massive experiment with untold costs and impacts that you need to be really careful about scrutinizing. You need to be what I say is a good American. So to understand what's happening at the Great Salt Lake, you need to go back to the turn of the century. So what you're looking at here is the Great Salt Lake from the year 1900 until 2020. This box on the right is a closer, we'll expand in a moment. This is an image from the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. I always like to cite when I take images from other organizations. And the minimum healthy level for the Great Salt Lake, 4198. It's that blue line right there, 4,198 feet above sea level. And so if we zoom in to that box on the right and we just look at the last quarter century, and we once again show the minimum healthy level, you can see that even though the record low of the Great Salt Lake happened in 2022, 4188.5 or 4189 feet above sea level, you can see that for most of this century, the Great Salt Lake has been below the minimum healthy level. And what didn't just happen since the 2022 record low. In fact, the only significance of the 2020 record low in my mind is that it finally ushered in the public scrutiny Utah decision makers needed to step into a sensible water policy future. That's really why it matters. And we really need to think about the fact that it's taken 25 years to get the public to this table to hold their elected and appointed government accountable. That's the power that we have here today in this room. That's why we're thankful for your joining us. So Utah's management of the Great Salt Lake is a failed policy experiment. Now, let's talk about that. That sounds really harsh. Policies are experiments. They have intended and unintended consequences. We'd love to believe that all policies are perfect, just right off the bat. They're great, they'll always be great. And the architects thereof are wonderful people. That's a nice idea. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Prohibition is a good example of a failed policy experiment. It had good intentions. There's a lot of reasons why alcohol was a social issue, especially to women, at the turn of the 20th century, because they were not the breadwinners, and the husband would blow the payroll down at the local tavern. Honestly, that's really what began the quest for prohibition. But unfortunately, the unintended consequences of that was murder and organized crime, racketeering, people dying from methyl alcohol when they thought they were drinking alcohol. Public input, scrutiny, public criticism is absolutely essential to good public policy. And when we have bad public policy, we need to get involved. That's everything. That is everything that should be driving us as Americans, because this is 25 years of failed policy and it needs to be rectified. So, how much water do we need to get to that minimum water level? Well, we need 859,000 acre-feet of water annually being delivered to the Great Salt Lake, in addition to all the existing water flows already making it there. Okay, so how much have we managed to deliver to the Great Salt Lake that wasn't already there before? We only can count water that wasn't already flowing into the Great Salt Lake. So since the 2022 record low, when the Utah legislature got busy and active in trying to address its chronic failure at the Great Salt Lake, we have only been able to deliver less than 100,000 acre-feet of extra water. Okay, so if we're going to save the Great Salt Lake in the year 2045, 20 years from now, we need 859,000 acre-feet per year for each of those 20 years. And we haven't even delivered 100,000 acre-feet of additional water, which means we can't even start the clock yet. That is our failure that we need to rectify. We need to get active. So this is a photo of Mono Lake. I need to ask everyone here a question. I'm going to ask you to vote with a raise of hands, okay? So California, Los Angeles was diverting the water flowing into Mono Lake until public alarm was raised, and then something happened to protect Mono Lake. So after Mono Lake began to disappear because of upstream water diversions, what happened that prevented the total disappearance of the lake? You got a multiple choice here. Was it A, the purchase of water rights, or B, something else? Show of hands. How many people think that what happened to save Mono Lake was that water rights were purchased? How many people think it was something else? Okay, so most of the room knows that that something else was the public trust. I presume that most of the room knows that a lawsuit began from good Americans looking to avail themselves of their right to embrace the checks and balances of democracy, to go into the judicial system and hold executive and elected government accountable. That's what the public trust is. It's something we got, ironically, from the King of England. The idea that we, the public, own the fish and game of this wonderful continent as Americans. And so the Supreme Court of California ruled in favor of the plaintiffs who went into court to protect Mono Lake by using the public trust, the fiduciary duty to safeguard the natural resources through common law, through decision-making in the judicial branch of government. Man, I am so thankful we have a judicial branch of government, because even though, no offense to lawyers in this room, nobody loves to go spend money on an attorney, at least you have that protection. And so Utah Rivers Council and Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment are honored to be part of a coalition involved in a lawsuit against the state of Utah to apply the public trust. And what's interesting on the Great Salt Lake specifically, and what's interesting is in California, when the decision was made to bring down the fact that Californians had a right to a mono lake to exist using the public trust. The court ruled such uses should not be destroyed because the state mistakenly thought itself powerless to protect them. Utah's running around pretending the only way to solve the Great Salt Lake is to buy the water. Look, there's nothing wrong with buying water for the Great Salt Lake. It's definitely a component of the solution. But if we're going to pretend like we are not going to regulate upstream water diversions, like we have no control as a community, as if there are no rules on the road, there are no stoplights or stop signs, there's no licensing of driver's licenses or automobiles. If we're going to pretend like regulation doesn't exist, then what is the point of having government? What is the point of these people running for office? We have received so much criticism for the lawsuit. We have received so much criticism for criticism, it's ridiculous. Thomas Jefferson said it best. No government should be without critics. If its intentions are good, then it has nothing to fear from criticism. It is American to want to apply the public trust to the Great Salt Lake. If you hear somebody criticizing litigation or criticizing critics of failed water policies in Utah, you need to say, you're not being a good American. So I'm going to pass it to Dr. Moench now. Before I do, I just want you to know about legislation that passed this morning's Water Development Commission to restrict the state's ability to protect the public welfare on streams and rivers. This bill passed committee and now is headed for the 2026 general session. At a time when we should be leaning in to protect the Great Salt Lake, the state of Utah is stepping back from its protections. If that is news to you, then you need to scrutinize what you're being told by anybody saying the state's doing a good job. Criticism of the state of Utah is a healthy American activity. We're Utahns. We have thick skins. Let's stand up and hold our appointed and elected government accountable for a future with the Great Salt Lake. I'd like to have pass the ball now to Dr. Brian Moench.
Advancing is, there you go.
You have to point to the thing.
Right there.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. So sorry.
All right, that looks a little bit better. My job in the next 10 minutes is to scare you to death. And I'm pretty good at that because most people leave anything that I say with post-traumatic stress disorder. So in that pursuit, let's talk a little bit about this. With regard to the desiccation of the Great Salt Lake and its potential disappearance, I want to say we've been down this kind of road many times before. Both federal and the state governments have a long history of ignoring potential health hazards related to environmental toxins. Here's just a short list of those things: leaded paint and gasoline, asbestos, mercury, hexavalent chromium, perchlorate, numerous pesticides like DDT, chlorpyrifos, cigarettes, PFAS, forever chemicals, BPA, PCBs, flame retardants, nuclear radiation, OxyContin, and numerous pharmaceuticals. We've been down this road so many times. And because our physicians group does not want Utah to go down this road again, we spent the last 18 months looking at all the medical literature and tried to come up with the most comprehensive document yet as to what does the medical literature say about the potential for public health harm if we allow the Great Salt Lake to disappear. So I'm glad to know that the legislature met this morning, and I got a photograph of their meeting. Needless to say, the problem has not been solved. And I want to scare you to death about what happens if we don't solve the problem. Okay, after all of our 18 months, over 500 medical studies that were evaluated, the problem is much worse than we thought. The health hazard has been underanalyzed, underestimated, and underreported. First, It's much more than just the obvious visible dust storms. We're all worried about that sort of thing, but that's not really the heart of the problem. I'm going to explain more about that in just a second. That's because the smallest, most dangerous particles are launched by frequent low-level winds that don't really register as dust storms. This is not a 15 times a year issue. It's almost a 24/7 issue. Now, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with nomenclature, PM10 means particles 10 microns in size and smaller, PM2.5, 2.5 microns and smaller, and ultrafine means microns, particles 0.1 microns in size and smaller. If you were to look at a kind of a depiction of a particle's journey from the atmosphere to where it could really start doing damage to everybody's health, it would look like this. You take an ultrafine particle in the atmosphere over Salt Lake City, and the first step is it penetrates a building like the one we're in now or your home. And then it gets inhaled by your lungs, and then it gets picked up by your bloodstream, and then circulated throughout your body. And then these particles can actually knock on the door of individual cells throughout every critical organ that you have. There are about 40 trillion human cells that are critical to everyone's health. And then here's an electron micrograph showing that these particles actually penetrate cells, in this case, in the brain. Everyone here sitting in this audience has penetration of your brain from air pollution particles from multiple sources. That's the journey. At every single stage along that journey, size matters. The smaller the particle, the more easily it makes that journey all the way to inside your critical organs. So what this looks like from another context is you have a healthy person here who breathed clean air in Australia for their entire life, and their lung looks like this. Here you have a lifelong resident of Sydney, Australia, that has generally less air pollution than Salt Lake City, and that's a non-smoker's lung. And that's because these little tiny particles, the smallest ones, 50% of them may stay there indefinitely. Now, if I take any of you to the operating room and I have a surgeon who opens up your chest and we look at your lungs, most of you who are as old as I am, your lungs are going to look more like that than like that. The third concept is mineral dust is toxic all by itself. Don't let anybody tell you dust is natural, therefore it's not harmful. If it's silica, if it's calcium carbonate, that's still viewed by the body as an invasion of a foreign matter, and it triggers an immunologic response, which then triggers a chemical cascade causing inflammation, which is the chronic common denominator of most adult diseases. So even if there's nothing attached, the dust itself has a toxic response. Particle number and surface area matter. Let me illustrate it this way. Think of a PM10 particle as a big brass ball. Think of an ultrafine particle as all these silver balls. If they're both captured on the same EPA filters, they will weigh the same. And then they'll get reported by government agencies as having the same toxicity. Nothing could be further from the truth because all the surface area of those silver balls is massively greater than the brass ball. And surface area matters as much as size for this reason. More surface area means more direct interaction with human tissues and more attached toxins. What can be attached with this Trojan horse effect? If the Trojan horse is a dust particle, you can have heavy metals embedded in that particle or attached to it, pesticides, industrial chemicals of all kinds, microplastics, radionuclides, pathogens. 1 gram of dust, which is about a teaspoon, can be home for 1 billion microorganisms, 30,000 different types of microorganisms. So there's a whole host of diseases we know can be transmitted by pathogens that are tag-along toxins to these dust particles. And then we know now that there are actually new toxins created by complex chemical reactions between urban air pollution and these dust particles, creating things like nitrates, nitrous acid, nitrogen dioxide, nitrated PAHs, nitrile chloride, things you've never heard of and don't want to ever hear again. And this is a really important concept. Toxicity is cumulative and measurement flaws are currently limiting and underestimate the severity. Now I illustrate it this way. A patient comes up to us in the emergency room, carried by their family, they're unconscious. We ask the family, well, what's the patient been taking? Well, they say, well, a safe dose of aspirin, safe dose of Advil, safe dose of Tylenol, safe dose of Valium, Percocet, OxyContin, Halcyon, Gabapentin, Nyquil, Tramadol, Dilaudid, 3 glasses of wine, 2 martinis, and 3 beers. Every single one of them was safe individually. The patient is comatose and may be dead, but the cumulative toxicity here is what counts, and it's what counts in Great Salt Lake toxins, all of which we don't have time to talk about. But don't let anybody tell you that because a certain level of one toxin is below a certain threshold, everything's fine. That's not the case. Now, we also have specific studies, and I'm going to be out of time here in just a second, showing that Great Salt Lake dust is in fact more toxic than other sources of Great Basin dust, more toxic even than coal fly ash, and that's very toxic stuff. So the uncomfortable reality is that almost certain everyone here living along the Wasatch Front has contamination of all their critical organs with microscopic pollution particles, some of which originated from the Great Salt Lake lake bed. Now, this is a little bit of sick mythological humor. Okay, why do we have all these toxins? Well, we have it because of MagCorp. MagCorp was declared by our EPA in the 1990s as the greatest polluting industry in the United States, responsible for 92% of our air pollution problem along the Wasatch Front and 73% of all the pollution in our soil, air, and water. Kennecott Copper Mine has been pouring out heavy metals in our environment for 120 years. There are 28 sewage treatment plants that discharge into the Great Salt Lake or its tributaries. We all know about the nuclear weapons testing that still has contaminated the Great Basin with things like cesium, strontium, and even plutonium. Natural pathogens that we talked about. In fact, we now know that the likely cause of increased asthma rates around people who live by the Salton Sea of California is fragments of bacterial cell wall, gram-negative bacteria. We have pesticides being sprayed to try and control Phragmites and mosquitoes all around the Great Salt Lake. And then we have these new toxic compounds that I just mentioned. So what could possibly go wrong when we have surrounded the Great Salt Lake with all of these sources of environmental toxins? Well, a lot. Just a couple of things to chew on. 90% of cosmetics have nano-sized plastic beads embedded in them, and they're going to end up in the Great Salt Lake from our sewage treatment plants. Heavy metals now are known to be acting also as endocrine disruptors, and the significance of that is that means they're toxic at extremely small concentrations, because endocrine disruption by definition is an antagonism or an augmenting of human hormones that has a whole long list of disease outcomes. This is my favorite organ. Anybody know what that is?
The brain.
You're the only person in 16 of these who's ever gotten that right. That's my favorite organ, and it should be all of your favorite organs because your health is determined more by that organ than almost any other thing that has ever happened to you, and the integrity of that organ is actually the gateway to your health for the rest of your life.
Some people didn't hear.
And I'm out of time.
Some people didn't hear what that was.
Oh, placenta, in case you didn't hear. Well, now we know that virtually every placenta, everyone from almost every country, but in Utah as well, is contaminated with these air pollution particles and with plastic nanoparticles. That means the fetus is too. We now know that everyone here has a brain contaminated with microplastics, plastic nanoparticles, and about 50% more than autopsy studies would suggest 8 years ago. 3 to 5 times more in patients that have dementia, 70 to 30 times more than concentrations in the liver and kidneys, and also found in bone marrow, blood, breast milk, semen, and placenta. Not all of that came from the Great Salt Lake. A lot of it comes from many other sources, but that's embedded in the Great Salt Lake. We know that it's there, and it's part of the overall toxic profile, and I'm out of time. And we're going to open up for questions.
Questions over here?
That means we've got people so depressed they can't even
Yes.
speak.
Yesterday, the gentleman who spoke at the end of the day said it would cost a fortune to just let the water back in the lake. He wouldn't expound on that because he was saying how much it would cost to mitigate the dust. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that what that was expressed about was the option of trying to buy water. This idea that the only way we can get water to the Great Salt Lake is by purchasing it, which again is partly why I put those slides in today. We can regulate upstream water diversions. Utah is the most wasteful municipal water user in the United States. You want to debate the data with me? Bring it on. I've been up and down, backwards and forwards with that data. I am telling you, we are the most wasteful water user in the country. You cannot find a larger secondary water system in the entire world used to grow Kentucky bluegrass. It does not exist. If you were on the Star Trek Enterprise and you went to Earth and you're like, we need to find water and we need the most wasteful community, boom, here you are. Okay, we need to regulate this wasteful water use. We need to stop worrying about the impacts of regulation. You don't argue against stoplights by saying people should be allowed to drive at any speed they want. You just don't. So it's a fraction of the cost to regulate upstream water diversions as it is to build a 10 or 20 or $30 billion air quality mitigation system. Our legislature is pursuing the most costly future, and you will all, and we will all have water rate increases to pay for this regulatory failure. I can be more depressing than Brian, I promise.
Well, I would like to know who's watching out for people's health and what kind of statistics and research is being done on that. I have stage 4 lung cancer, EGFR mutation that's been proven around the world in very polluted cities to be caused by pollution. And it's my only risk factor. But when I talk about it with my oncology team, nobody seems to be aware of it. And that totally baffles me. So I'm alarmed that nobody is actually really following that. Certainly I'm a nurse midwife, which is why I knew it was a placenta. But I do see in the news about premature babies and kids with more asthma and bronchitis, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not seeing anything following cancers.
I'm very glad that you're still here with us. You and I know each other from a few years back. You know, we have been accused of being alarmists. We can look at the same data that someone else from a scientific background a little different than ours and come up with different conclusions about how much of a concern. Our background, in almost every case, our board members or some of them are researchers, but almost all of us are clinicians. And we look at that data from the experience of many of us, if not all of us, having taken care of patients like you. So when I see statistics that someone else, because of their scientific background, is stuck in a lab, may look at that as abstractions and statistics, I look at it through the lens of people that I know, faces that I have encountered in the emergency room, in the operating room, in the office, who are suffering from the exact same kind of diseases that you are, including people in my own family. So I have a much more visceral response to that kind of information. And if I'm accused as being an alarmist, I'm actually proud of that. Because if I can prevent one person from getting what you have suffered from, then it will have all been worth it. And our community should feel that way in its entirety.
So we're out of time. If you have any other questions, you can stay after and ask Zach and Brian. Thank you again, guys.
Thank you.